Hey everyone, we are on chapter 6, which is called A Sad Arrival. You starts with Mrs. Poovy's room, 'cause that's how far I done, Tilly said, stumbling into the parlor. After you sweeps, you make up a bed, 'cause there's another old one coming in. When you finishes Mrs. Poovy, you moves along to Mr. Bottle and Mr. Dobbs. After that, as Tilly droned on, Emily's thoughts wandered to the cobwebs and cracked cupids on the ceiling, the tarnished gilt and decaying plaster, the fog creeping past the windows, and the shadows creeping in the parlor. A few of the old people were already stationed in their chairs, staring vacantly ahead, occupied in waiting for their day to end. Tilly stopped suddenly at the foot of the stairs by the bowl of glistening peppermints. Well, you already knows what you ain't allowed to touch, so now you learns where you ain't allowed to go. And that's one place. She pointed a threatening finger towards a closed door at the far end of the parlor. It's Mrs. M's and Mrs. P's dining room, which you was so rudely groping at last night after dinner. Across from it, Mrs. M's room. You specially ain't allowed in that one. You gets that? Yes, Tilly, replied Emily, who had as much desire to walk into Mrs. Meaching's room as to enter a pit of snakes. Am I allowed to go into the ballroom? Ballroom? Said Tilly suspiciously. What ballroom? Ain't no ballroom in this house. Then she snickered. You thinks you come to a castle? There was one when I was here long ago, Emily said, remembering the beautiful ball Aunt and Uncle Twice had held for Mama and Papa in the grand room across from the dining room. It was right, but the doors aren't there anymore. Instead of two elegant gilded doors, Emily found herself pointing to a blank wall with two dreary pictures hanging from it. Course not, stupid. Ain't no ballroom, ain't no doors. Y'all brains must be melting from no eating. Anyone who's so picky about the food, glaring at Emily, Tilly started up the stairs. A whole ballroom had disappeared. That's Mrs. P's room, said Tilly shortly, pointing to another closed door at the head of the stairs. Them other doors goes to rooms which ain't occupied. Howsomever, doors go to room. Oh, they have to be done up because Mrs. M shows them to prospective customers. Most times your aunt allows me to take care of them, Tilly added proudly as she turned to start up another stairway. This one was enclosed and led to an ordinary hallway, also lined with doors. These ain't yours neither, said Tilly, and started up another set of stairs. These were very narrow and steep, and Emily's legs ached by the time she arrived at their final destination. A narrow, dark hallway pungent with the smell of dust and old wood peculiar to attics. Outside, a half-open door, a broom and a mop leaned wearily against a bucket filled with sponges, soaps, and rags. A feather duster poked from the bucket like a rooster's tail. Without knocking, Tilly stumbled through the doorway into a room as sparsely furnished and almost as uninviting as Emily's underground cell. Tilly began at once to instruct her on how to clean the room, completely ignoring a little woman in a frayed black wool shawl sitting beside her cot with tiny bird-sized hands folded quietly in her lap. Emily tried to keep her mind on Tilly's lecture, but it kept wandering to the little old woman who sat staring out the bare window with empty eyes as if Emily and Tilly were not even there. This was the tiny, helpless creature who had dared to take the peppermints and had been locked in the remembrance room. This was Mrs. Poovy. Emily, ain't you paying no attention? Tilly said crossly. Oh, yes, Tilly. Emily quickly picked up a sheet and began to clumsily spread it over the thin hair mattress. Shorted Tilly. Well, minds you doesn't dawdle. She stumped fiercely into a room, marching back down the stairs with heavy, accusing footsteps. Emily went on to rush, still with the difficult problem of getting the sheet straight on the cot. From time to time, she looked shyly over her shoulder at Mrs. Poovy. For all the attention she paid her new young housekeeper, however, Mrs. Poovy might as well have been made of wax. Emily tightened her arms around the pillow and drew in a deep breath. It's awfully dreadfully foggy today, isn't it? Mrs. Poovy didn't even blink. Emily swallowed hard. It might be sunnier tomorrow, don't you think? If Mrs. Poovy thought that, she gave no sign of it. With a With a soft sigh, Emily set the pillow on the cot. Now there seemed to be nothing left to do but go on with her work. She sloshed out of the basin and emptied it into the slop jar as Tilly had directed. Then Emily whisked the feather duster over the furnishings and finally began to sweep. She had entirely given up the idea of any conversation with Mrs. Poovy. So, to fill the lonely, uncomfortable stillness, she began to hum under her breath. So hum became words. London Bridge is falling down, sang Emily. Whoosh, went the broom. Falling down, whoosh, falling down, whoosh. Suddenly, almost without her knowing it, the words began to change. I'll get braver by and by, by and by, by and by. All I have to do is try, my fair lady. I will never groan and sigh, groan and sigh, groan and sigh. Mrs. M can't make me cry, my fair lady. Flustered by what she had done, Emily looked shyly at Mrs. Poovy. Was that a spark in her eyes? Emily's heart leapt, but when she looked again, the spark was gone. In any event, her work in that room was done, so she picked up her broom and mop and bucket. But as she turned to leave, she remembered something else. Despite the way Tilly behaved, Mrs. Poovy was not a chair or a table. She was a person. Emily dropped a curtsy. Good day, Mrs. Poovy, she said. I am so pleased to have met you. I love how Emily treats people, by the way. But Mrs. Poovy might well have been a chair or a table. She never smiled or even so much as blinked. Feeling dejected and hopeless, Emily left to find the room described by Tilly as belonging to Mr. Bottle and Mr. Dobbs. Wearing patched thin sweaters and baggy threadbare trousers, Mr. Bottle and Mr. Dobbs were seated across from one another on the only two chairs in the room, chairs as straight and stiff as old wooden skeletons. Mr. Dobbs was snoring with his chin dropped so far into his hollow chest it seemed intent on working its way to the opposite wall. He looked as if he might have fallen asleep over his reading, except there was nothing to read in his lap unless you considered two gnarled hands to be a book or a newspaper. The other sound in the room came from Mr. Bottle's thin, red nose. He was just as Tilly had said, the one with a handkerchief, a tattered gray piece of cloth that might have been retired from duty as a cleaning rag because there was so little service left in it. Besides honking into this relic, Mr. Bottle was suddenly a small scrap of paper. It was wrinkled, worn soap wrapper, Emily discovered when she made up his bed, because as soon as she came in, he quickly thrust it under the mattress. It was as if he was actually afraid to be caught reading. As for any cheer or conversation, Emily soon learned that neither of them would come from that room. Mr. Dobbs did never wake up while she was there, and Mr. Bottle only gave muffled replies in one word or less from behind his handkerchief to every attempt at conversation that Emily made. The only sounds that came from the room were the whooshing, thumping, swishing, accompanied by the mournful chorus of honking and snoring. Emily's next sad encounter was Mrs. Quick, a lady so tall she seemed like a piece of elastic stretched as far as it could go, then allowed to grow old and brittle in that position so it could never spring back. At the moment Emily entered Mrs. Quick's room, the old lady was seated in her chair, waving her fingers about in the most curious way. As soon as she caught sight of Emily, she quickly laid her hands on her lap, but not before Emily guessed what was happening. She was doing make-believe embroidery, without embroidery thread, needle, or canvas. Emily, however, could no more start a conversation with Mrs. Quick than she could with anyone else. But while she was doing her chores in the sad, silent room, she came to a decision. For the moment, she would forget about Uncle Twice, about the missing ballroom, and about all other mysteries of Sugar Hill Hall. She would devote all her energies towards bringing some happiness, no matter how little, to the pitiful old residents that lived there, silent and forgotten, in the upper reaches of this evil mansion. Filled with thoughts of how she might accomplish this, most of them hopeless, she finished her chores and then decided she better find Tilly with the next instructions. But where was Tilly now? Suddenly the mansion seemed filled with a gloomy hush. Tilly was nowhere to be found. Emily decided finally that she would have to try the floor below. Carefully, she tiptoed down the next flight of steps. Creak, pop, snap. The wooden steps under her feet sounded loud as firecrackers. Mrs. Plumley's room lay almost directly at the foot of the stairs, and she wanted to get past it as quickly as possible. 2 steps to go. 1 more step to go. No more steps. And then there was Miss Plumley's door. It had been closed when Emily had come up the stairs with Tilly, but now it was a gaping hole. Emily shriveled back to the safety of the dark stairwell. Unless she retreated all the way back up the stairs, there was no way to escape going by that door, and she must find Tilly. After waiting a few moments to gather courage, Emily took a deep breath, locked it in her chest, and started out again. She intended to skitter past the doorway like a small insect, not looking at it. But when she reached it, an unbearable curiosity drew her eyes in. She let out her breath with a gasp. There was no one in the room, but what a room it was. A fire crackled invitingly in a red brick fireplace. Pictures of laughing children danced across wallpaper. Crocheted doilies sat on plump chairs and gleaming walnut tables like patches of spring snow. On a tiny mahogany chest of drawers, red-breasted berries nested in a golden china bowl beside a basket, spilling over with tangled skeins of yellow wool as soft-looking as eiderdown. The room was as cozy as Mrs. Plumley herself. Now she could stand and gaze at the room for hours, but the gloomy clock in the dining room was already tolling the hour of 11, and Tilly must be found at once. Quickly, Emily crept past the enticing room. But as she rounded the balcony, she glanced at the giant mirror that rose up from the first landing, reflecting the whole grim parlor below, as clearly as a stereopticon slide. And what she saw brought her to a dead stop. Her heart seemed to jump into her throat and lay there, frozen. Standing before the great oak door of Sugar Hill Hall, just as Emily had walked through it, were Mrs. Meaching and Mrs. Plumley. Aunt Twice was in the reflected picture, too, opening the door to 4 people. 2 women, a man, and a boy. All 4 of them were enormously fat. The man had a round pink face, tremendous jowls, and smooth as silk, and tiny slanted eyes. He was dressed in an expensive black suit with rich gold chain resting on his stomach. The boy, except for being shorter, looked to be his exact copy. One of the 2 women, much older than the other, though no less fat, was sobbing violently into an impossibly tiny lace handkerchief. Something in the back of Emily's mind warned her. If you can see in the mirror, you also can be seen. Swiftly, she crouched down behind the balcony railing. "So, Mr. and Mrs. Porkis, you have brought us Mrs. Loops," said Mrs. Meaching. "Yes, Mrs. Meaching, we have brought her just as we said we would," Mr. Porkis said nervously. Just as we said we would," he repeated, looking quite miserable. His arms waved about in a distracted manner as if he were trying to find something to hang on to. The older woman, who Emily suspected was Mrs. Loops, began to sob again into her small handkerchief. Mrs. Porkis dropped her first chin consolingly into her second, which then, in turn, dropped into her third. "There, dear auntie," she said, "look at this grand parlor. I'm sure you'll be quite comfortable here." "Your wife is quite right, Mr. Porkis. Your aunt will indeed be completely comfortable." Emily had trouble recognizing this soothing voice as belonging to Mrs. Meaching, though it did. Another heart-trending sob from Auntie Porkis, otherwise Mrs. Loops, seemed to have no effect on anybody. All the while this was going on, the boy staring at the bowl of peppermints across from the parlor, his jaws moving mysteriously inside his fat cheeks, as if he were actually chewing one. At last he began pulling rudely on his mother's coat and sleeve and pointing. "If Albert might be spared one of your delicious peppermints," inquired Miss Porkis of Miss Meaching. "Indeed," said Mrs. Meaching, with a shade less soothing oil than her reply. Then the whole joyous party processed across the parlor to the peppermint bowl. What astonished Emily was no one in the Porkis family seemed to pay any attention, much less even see the other old people lined up on either side of the parlor. No one, that is, except for Auntie, who looked fearfully from left to right, and then threw a fresh wave of useless sobs into her sodden handkerchief. We have had the pleasure of our boarders, although we don't encourage the habit, said Mrs. Meaching, as they all stood worshipfully around the glistening bowl. Bad for the teeth, she hissed at Albert. Then his lips stretched out like two thin rubber bands, which must have been intended for a smile. Albert paid no attention to her. The little eyes in his round face stared greedily at the peppermints. All at once his pudgy hand darted out to snatch 3 of them and stuff them into his mouth. Then Mr. and Mrs. Porkis gazed at him fondly. He grabbed a whole handful of them and stuffed them in his pocket, his face turning scarlet with greed and excitement. Mrs. Meaching's mouth continued to smile, though the rest of her stiffened perceptibly. But when Albert showed no signs of stopping, her smile grew thinner and thinner, and finally disappeared altogether. Mrs. Lucknock, she snapped, you may now show Mrs. Loop to her room. Then she firmly steered the remaining Porkis family with peppermint-flavored Albert trotting happily beside them through the front door. In the air, aware of the sudden frost in the air, seemed so relieved to have gotten rid of Auntie that they offered no resistance at all. Emily remained hidden until Mrs. Meaching returned to her room, and Aunt Twice accompanied Mrs. Plumley and led the sobbing Mrs. Loops down the stairs. Too shaken to now continue her search for Tilly, Emily slipped noiselessly down the stairs and made her way to the kitchen. One person she did not want to see there when she arrived was Kipper. But she shouldn't have worried about that. When she arrived, the kitchen was empty. A few scales still clinging damply to the gray sink were the only signs that the fishmonger's boy had ever been there. All right, we will read chapter 7 soon. It is called Peppermint Peril. I will see you guys soon. I hope you have an amazing break.